Welcome. We are about to dive into one of history's most fascinating and debated artifacts, the Shroud of Turin, but we're going to look at it through a whole new lens: cutting-edge DNA science. So get ready, because an ancient mystery is about to crash right into modern forensics. And we're starting with a real head-scratcher. I mean, for centuries, the story of this cloth has been centered entirely in the Middle East and Europe. So what on earth could possibly connect this famous Christian relic all the way to the Indian subcontinent? Well, it turns out that modern genetic sequencing has, you could say, pulled a brand new thread from this ancient fabric. And believe me, it leads to a completely unexpected place. This is really where our whole story takes a fascinating turn.
Okay, so before we get into all the new science, let's do a quick refresh on the basics. What exactly is the Shroud of Turin, and why does it hold such powerful significance for millions of people?
So, here's the deal. It's this long piece of linen cloth, right? It lives in a cathedral in Turin, Italy. And on it, you can just make out this faint, almost ghostly image of a man who appears to have been crucified. Now, for countless believers, this is it, the actual cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus.
Now, this timeline shows us the history that we do know, but what's really wild is that huge gap right in the middle. After the crucifixion, the cloth basically vanishes from the historical record for about 500 years. It only pops back up in the Middle Ages in France, before eventually finding its way to Turin. That massive blank space has always been a huge part of its mystery.
As you can imagine, an object this famous has been put under the scientific microscope more than a few times. So let's take a look at how our attempts to solve its riddles have changed over the years.
And this really shows you the incredible leap in technology, doesn't it? Early on, researchers were focused on physical clues, things you could see, like an unusual weave or traces of cotton, which, was pretty rare in the ancient Middle East, but super common in India. Today, we've gone from looking at threads with a magnifying glass to sequencing the actual DNA left behind on them. It's a whole new ballgame.
So that little bit of Indian cotton, it actually sparked this fascinating, though you gotta say, highly controversial theory. People wrote books with titles like Jesus Lived in India, suggesting that the materials themselves pointed to a journey made by the man in the cloth. It was a really compelling idea. But as you'll see, the latest science suggests those clues might be pointing to a totally different story.
So now, let's get to the new research, because it really does paint a completely different picture. This is where a field called metagenomics comes into play, which is basically the study of all the genetic material you can find in a single sample. Think of it like taking all the dust from an ancient cloth and figuring out the DNA story of every single particle. And the key to this whole new discovery, it lies in these tiny dust and debris samples that were officially collected from the Shroud way back in 1978. Scientists are now taking these decades-old samples and hitting them with 21st century technology to unlock secrets that have been hiding there all along. Okay, so after sequencing all the human DNA they could find in those samples, what did they discover? Something pretty stunning. Look at this number. Nearly 40%, 38.7 to be exact, of all the human genetic traces could be linked back to people from the Indian subcontinent. And this really puts that number into perspective. We are not talking about some tiny random trace here. The Indian genetic footprint is by far one of the most significant signatures found on the cloth, right up there with DNA from the Middle East and Europe. This is a massive piece of the puzzle. So what does this nearly 40% of Indian DNA actually mean? It's a huge clue, and it's led researchers to a really fascinating new theory, one that completely rewrites the history not of the man, but of the cloth itself. And this is the first question that pops into your head, right? If there's so much Indian DNA, does that finally prove that old theory that the man in the shroud must have traveled to India? Well, according to these researchers, the answer is probably no. See, the new theory suggests we've been looking at this all wrong. The story isn't about the person, it's about the textile. The DNA isn't necessarily from the person who was wrapped in it, but from the countless people who handled it over its very long life, starting with the very people who wove it in the first place.
Okay, so here's how the new theory unfolds, step by step. First, we know ancient India was an absolute powerhouse when it came to making textiles. Second, we know there was a really active trade route for these fine fabrics straight into the Roman Empire.
So, step 3, the most logical conclusion, is that the shroud itself was probably woven in India, carrying the genetic traces of its makers before it was ever exported west.
So, the real takeaway here is this. The DNA evidence tells an amazing story about global trade in the ancient world. The Indian DNA doesn't seem to point to one man's journey, but to the journey of the cloth itself, a journey that started in the hands of artisans in ancient India and ended with it becoming one of the most sacred objects in the world.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. This latest science might not settle the ultimate debate about the man's identity, but it may have just solved one of the shroud's oldest mysteries. Not who it wrapped, but where it came from. It tells a story not just of faith, but of commerce, craftsmanship, and a surprisingly connected ancient world. Thanks so much for joining us.